Okay, we've left off last time in Acts 21, and we're going to pick right up there. Paul has already been warned prophetically, and I think about three occasions we see here that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to be bound, and people are trying to discourage him from going, but he's resolute. He's going to go to Jerusalem, much like Jesus had set his face to go to Jerusalem because he knew he was going to suffer and complete his mission. Paul's got it in his heart that he needs to get back to Jerusalem. So we picked that up about we left off in Acts 21:15. After these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. So Paul's on his way, and so we'll look at chapter 21, verse 27. He arrives in Jerusalem, and it says, and when the 7 days he went through this purification thing and dedicated himself because people were saying, the Jews are upset because you're bringing Gentiles and all this, and they think that he's bringing them into the temple, and he's really not doing any of that, but they're upset, and so he's trying to make it at least look good when he gets there. And it says in verse 27, when the 7 days were almost over, he did a kind of a dedication himself to the Lord and purification. The Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up the multitude and laid hands on him. So laid hands on him doesn't mean they're praying for him. That means they're arresting him, they're seizing him, taking him into custody. Crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. Besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." So their accusations are unfounded, they're not true, but they're so riled up. And when we're riled up against somebody, no matter what they do, we're going to say they're wrong. If you don't like one of our presidents, over the past few years, you're one side or the other. No matter what they do, you're going to say, they could say Jesus is Lord, and they say, they're faking it. So, and right here, they're upset with Paul so much that they're going to come up with any accusation, and so they're saying, he's against Moses and the law and everything we've ever believed, and he's even defiling our temple. And he wasn't. Well, they actually are so enraged. It says in verse 31, and while they were seeking to kill him, so. They've got him in there, and he's just wanting to be to Jerusalem to worship and be there for the Halat, for the feast days, and they're wanting to kill him. And it says a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. Verse 32, and at once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. When they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So Paul's being rescued by the commander of the forces here, the Roman forces coming down to rescue him because the whole city's in confusion over him. I mean, Paul has really become quite a figure that's just galvanizing two sides of an issue. It seems like you're either really for him or you're really against him, and the ones really against him apparently are the ones that have the microphone. Although they didn't have microphones in those days, but they're the ones with the voice right now. They're the ones that are in leadership. And they're the ones that are telling people things, and they're basically spreading that Paul is, this evil man. He's coming against our religion, and Paul's thinking, what he's doing, he's fulfilling the purpose of all of Judaism is looking to the Messiah, and he's just saying the Messiah's come. And so there's this great conflict. So we get to chapter 22, and all of what we're looking at here from chapter 21 to the end of Acts is how Paul gets to Rome. This is his mission to Rome. His thing is he wants to go to Rome. He feels like he's been called to Rome. Even the Lord appears to him in some places, says, I've appointed you to go to Rome. You must testify in Rome. And so Paul's making this mission, and so the rest of the end of the book of Acts is Paul getting to Rome. And he's going through a lot of legal processes here. And so in chapter 22, he's giving his defense, and he's talking to a lot of Jewish people here. He says, "Brethren and fathers," verse 1, "hear my defense, which I now offer to you." And when they heard he was addressing them in the Hebrew dialect, they became even more quiet. And then he began to say, and he gave his whole testimony of when he was on his Damascus Road experience and what happened during that time. I want to bring up something in some of your translations that may be a little bit different here. In chapter 22, verse 9, it says, this is New American Standard, it says, "And those who were with me when he was struck down on the road to Damascus, those who were with me beheld the light, to be sure, but did not," and this one says, "understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me." Some translations just say, "did not hear a voice." While in chapter 9, if we look back there, and so some people think it's contradictory, because in chapter 9 it says when he was on the road to Damascus and he was struck down, it says the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. So here in chapter 9 it says they heard, the ones with him heard the voice. In chapter 22 it says they didn't hear the voice. The difference with that, and they do a pretty good job in this translation saying, to be sure, they saw the light but did not understand the voice. And that's what the hearing there means. Sometimes when the word hearing there is hearing with understanding, in chapter 9 it was just they heard something. Here it was, he's explaining they didn't hear what was said. It's not saying they didn't hear anything. They just didn't understand what was said. And so Paul's recounting his testimony there, and he goes through the whole story and he sums it up at the end of late middle of chapter 22. And he's talking about his whole history. He says, and when the blood of thy witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approving and watching out for the cloaks of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So Paul's explaining this thing here, and he says, I was standing, I was even against Stephen, and I was standing holding his cloaks. And he says, but the Lord said to him, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And he's speaking to a Jewish audience here. And so in verse 22, it says, they listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. As they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust in the air. Whoa, it's really a big ceremony. They're just going all out. This guy is crazy. We got to do something. This is bizarre. Verse 24, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging, that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. When they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? So they're taking Paul away, and because of this great disturbance, the leader, the commander, is going to scourge him and get an answer, truth serum. We're going to beat you till you tell us the truth. Well, they start to stretch him out, and Paul uses his Roman citizenship here. For the first time, we really see Paul, well, might not be the first time. But anyway, Paul uses his Roman citizenship and says, what are you doing? Is it legal for you to do this to me even though I'm a Roman citizen and I haven't been charged with anything? And it gets the commander a little nervous, says, he bought his citizenship, the commander. But Paul says, I was actually born that way. And so he realizes I can't do this to him. And so Paul forgoes the scourging at this point because the commander realizes he doesn't have a legal right to do that. So we get to chapter 23, and Paul is brought before the Jewish council. And it says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. His first statement, he says, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience. And in verse 2 it says, and the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. It's like, you can't say you've lived, you've got a clear conscience before God, and he's struck. And Paul's a pretty bold character. He says in verse 3, then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Wow, okay. And do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? Ooh, it sounds like some things going on today. The law is good for some people, but not for others. But the bystanders said, do you revile God's high priest? They're talking to Paul, and Paul said, I wasn't aware, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. That's probably something we need to take into heart a little bit today, and as Christians, and watch our mouths a little bit and with more honor and respect. And then it says in verse 6, but perceiving that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began to cry out in the council, brethren, I'm a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And as he had said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So Paul had seen, who this crowd was, who his audience was, and he says, hey, I can get the attention off of me. I'm on trial here for the resurrection for the dead. And then what happened is the Pharisees and the Sadducees start fighting each other like, hey, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And Sadducees, no, there is no resurrection of the dead. So Paul took the attention off himself in this particular situation, and it put it upon the people that were listening to him.